We're talking Michael Thomas fantasy football. When do you draft that wide receiver? This is a fantasy-focused episode to get paid. You are listening to Sean and David G from Guru Fantasy World. David, before we get started, I want to remind everybody we have the 2020 Fantasy Football Almanac and Draft Guide available on Amazon.com. Over 250 pages. It's over 300 players ranked. They're math-driven. I watch over 1,000 hours of football. That's more than the time for every regular season game. I have Game Pass. I go back. I plot the plays. I do a lot of film study, specifically fantasy football scouting, everybody. Nobody else does it. You can't find anything else like it. It's available on Amazon.com. Click the link below. David, how you doing today, my friend?
Doing fantastic. How you doing?
I'm doing all right, man. I'm doing all right. So, Michael Thomas, we were talking a little bit before recording here, and we're kind of running through the stats, and I have my book information up. I know you have some of your stats up, and we are just talking about how insane his 2019 season was. Insane even with 5 games at quarterback by Teddy Bridgewater. So Drew Brees wasn't even in the lineup for all 16 games. But why don't you talk about kind of the separation of the players? Because I know you have that up. Like, he was like how many points above the second place wide receiver last year?
Essentially, Michael Thomas was Christian McCaffrey at wide receiver. He was giving you 100-point advantage over the second place finisher, which is just humongous gap between first and second.
Yeah, it's about about 6 points, 6 to 7 points per game over the second place wide receiver, which is just crazy. And like I said, he did that with 5 games of Drew Brees on the bench and doing finger magic on the sideline, if everybody remembers, with his cast. Insane. And when Drew Brees went down relatively early in the season with that injury, my thought was, Michael Thomas, is he, what's his productivity going to be like? Because, Teddy Bridgewater, I like him, but he's not Drew Brees. I mean, there aren't a lot of people who are Drew Brees, right? There's like a handful of them. But he produced, man, and he produced well. And even if you're worried about injury this year to Drew Brees, they have Jameis Winston, I think the NFL's most glorified chucker of all time. He will just throw the ball up for grabs. And Michael Thomas is a guy that can come down with a lot of those balls. So what do you think about Michael Thomas this year, David? And then what do you think about him as a first-round pick? Because I remember your initial rankings on Twitter, a month or two back. You had him, I believe, maybe out of the top 10, which I did too. But that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. Is I don't know that that's the right thing to do, and I'll give some reasons why I think that would be. But why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, I do. It's hard for me as a Michael Thomas stan to kind of find the in-between of how much I actually love him as a player and how much I'm a running back first round or die basically kind of fantasy player.
Yeah.
And as much as I love Michael Thomas, I can't put him in the first round. Not with Alvin Kamara back healthy, not with Emmanuel Sanders being added to the team. I think Thomas is still a clear number 1 wide receiver, but there's just so much depth at the position that I'd rather start off the draft with a running back. Even late round run, I'd rather take Eckler, Josh Jacobs. I'm not a Derrick Henry fan. I'd rather start my draft with Derrick Henry than Michael Thomas, just because you can find those wide receivers later. Thomas due for at least a little bit of regression, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you have Emmanuel Sanders come in there in free agency. Alvin Kamara, in theory, should be back to being a factor in the passing game. So is that going to limit Michael Thomas? I think it will, but the big question here is how much regression is he going to get? And I'm looking at his 3-year stat for my book here. We have the 3 years of basically stat accumulation. So 2017, 149 targets, 104 receptions. 2018, 147 targets, 125 receptions. So actually 2 less targets, but 21 more catches. 2019, 185 targets, again, with Drew Brees out 5 of those games, 149 receptions, 1,725 yards, 9 touchdowns, which is interesting with as dominant as Michael Thomas is in terms of accumulating receptions and yardage. He hasn't eclipsed 9 touchdowns. You would think he would be a double-digit touchdown guy, but that's hard to do, especially in an offense with as many options as the Saints have. But so my big question here, and this isn't a question you or anything. It's really a question for the audience. So I'd love to get everybody's fill-in thing. If you're listening to this on the Get Paid podcast, comment. If you're watching this on YouTube, comment. I'd be curious to get your opinions on this. But if he's 100 points above the second-place wide receiver, is that enough value? Because I'm with you. I think you generally go running back early because those top running backs are so scarce that you're just never going to have another crack at him. Whereas you can generally find one or two wide receivers in the second, third, fourth round that will be a top 5 receiver. You just have to know where to look. So the question is, with Michael Thomas's regression, because statistically speaking, he's probably going to regress, when is that competitive advantage enough for you to take that? If I'm sitting at 8 or 9 or 10, I'm taking a hard look, because in a snake draft you have that swing. I'm taking a hard look at taking the number 1 receiver and then, getting one of those, second tier running backs who will be available then.
Whichever one falls.
Whichever one falls. You got, because I'm a big CEH guy for Kansas City, right? I like him a lot. I think I want to see him on tape first. I like him a lot. Some of these rookie running backs are very interesting. The regression projection for Jones in Green Bay, he's going to be more available. You mentioned Eckler. There are going to be some productive running backs in the second and third round. I need to play with the mock drafts. I need to see kind of how the draft shakes out if I were to draft Michael Thomas that early. But, if I have one of those deep first-round picks and I'm staring at Michael Thomas and I have the choice between him and, I don't know, name your running back, Josh Jacobs, it's a tough choice, man. It's a tougher choice than I thought it would have been at the start of the fantasy football season. But thoughts?
Well, I will say you are swaying me a little bit just because the more I do think about it, that running back tier at the end of the first round, beginning of the second, you can rank it almost however you want it.
Right.
Like it's hard to tell which guy is going to be better in that running back group. Whereas Michael Thomas, we almost know he's going to be the number 1 receiver. So if there are 2 or 3 running backs left that you like, and you're only 3 or 4 picks around from your second round pick, why not go with that wide receiver? Me personally, I'd probably honestly rather start 2 running backs though and get my wide receiver in the third round. So again, it just kind of comes down to that roster construction. I think you're still probably better off just passing on wide receiver altogether the first 2 rounds.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. I don't know if I would agree about the first 2 rounds this year, with the exception of Michael Thomas. If he's sitting in the second round, I think you got to take him. But another thing is, your league format too. We were just talking about Michael Thomas, 9 touchdowns. If you're in a standard league, you don't get any PPR, full PPR, half PPR, then I'm with you. I mean, I definitely kind of sitting dead red running back for at least the first 2 rounds. And another thing is, I have in my my redraft league, because every year you kind of roll some dice and you get whatever pick you have. The winner doesn't pick last or anything like that, the previous year's winner. And like 2 of the last 3 years, I've been sitting at the first pick or the third pick, which I personally hate those picks generally. Like last year, I would have sat there if I had the number 1 pick and taken Christian McCaffrey. But this year, we've been talking about Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley. I think the gap is smaller. So this is a year where if I ended up rolling the dice and getting the number 1 pick, I'd probably offer my draft position just straight up and say, somebody take my pick and I'll pick at number 6 and sit in the middle of the rounds and ride the wave, or maybe even take one of those deep picks. But yeah, at this point, okay, so let me backtrack. So one of the things that the Fantasy Football Almanac Draft Guide does, right? So I watched the 1,000 hours of football, but I also do computer projections. The computer projections this year brought Michael Thomas and another receiver super high up in the rankings. And I actually think in terms of total point outlay, they were top 2 receivers ended up in the top 6 of those computations. One was Michael Thomas and one was Tyreek Hill with a healthy this season, Patrick Mahomes. And actually the gap there was pretty close. And anybody who read my book last year knew I loved Tyreek Hill going into the season. But of course, Mahomes had the ankle thing first, then he had the patella. Tyreek Hill had the hamstring injury. He missed a few games. So actually, as a healthy companion, I don't think that Tyreek Hill and Patrick Mahomes were healthy at the same time until about week 12 last season. And they still did pretty damn well together. But what I'm thinking, Drafts Guide, and I'm just working my way through this, David, is if I'm sitting in like the top 5, let's say I have the 4th pick, I'm hoping Dalvin Cook slips to me. I handcuff him with Alexander Mattison like we've been saying in some previous episodes. I know I'm not going to get Michael Thomas in the swing, but I have a chance at Tyreek Hill, knowing that with my projection he comes back in the top 6. I feel personally pretty good about that board, and I think there's a good chance that would happen. But I think that's the only scenario where I would draft a receiver in the second round here, is if Michael Thomas or Tyreek Hill. And I'm never a tight end in the second round guy. I think that's too early for me, and I know I always miss Kelsey, or in previous years, I always miss Ertz. But for me, it's running back in the first 2 rounds, with the exception of maybe Michael Thomas at like pick 10, 11, 12, maybe Tyreek Hill at the back half of the second round. But what do you think about that?
You bring up the tight ends. Honestly, God, I feel terrible for saying all this about Michael Thomas. But I probably take Kelsey before Michael Thomas.
Just for competitive advantage?
It comes down to roster construction. Yeah. Wide receiver. I mean, look at the wide receivers in the 4th, 5th, 6th rounds.
I know.
And when it comes down to it, you need to look beyond draft day, I think. Unless you're the kind of guy who's not even going to attempt to make a trade, you need to look at what you're going to be able to do with these players on the trade market. You start off with that 2 running backs or running back and tight end in the first 2 rounds. You set yourself up at the 2 scarcest markets, running back and tight end. It's hard to find. Mm-hmm. You wait on the wide receivers. You can trade up the wide receiver ladder. You can throw a half-eaten bagel and a bucket of bones at people who are desperate for a running back or tight end, and they'll upgrade your wide receiver position. So I don't think you're going to have any issue trading those 4th and 5th and 6th round receivers and getting a guy like almost say Tyreek Hill. You can trade into a Tyreek Hill midseason. You can trade in to Devontae Adams mid-season. People get desperate at running back. They get desperate at tight end. And if you hold assets at those positions, you can easily upgrade your wide receivers.
Especially in standard leagues, because if you're not getting any PPR, it doesn't dilute the market at running back. And you're right. I mean, roster construction, I always talk about scarcity of resources, almost look at it like a stock market, is you want assets at those positions in depth at running back because it gives you options down the line. Like I'm not like I like Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes this year, a cut above, a lot of the other quarterbacks, but quarterbacks these days, that market is commoditized. You can get a subpar passing quarterback who runs the ball. Josh Allen, his completion percentage is less as a passer, and yes, I know he has room to grow. Don't get too mad at me, Buffalo fans, but as a passer, he's raw, and you would admit that too. But he gets so many yards on the ground, and he gets so many rushing touchdowns. He can be a fantasy football easily top 10 quarterback. I think he was last year, as a matter of fact. Deshaun Watson, people are a little bit more down on him last year. I actually just came out with a rankings refresh, which is now in publication, by the way. Latest publication of the book, I think, is like June 6th at this point with rankings. But Deshaun Watson, without DeAndre Hopkins, I think he's going to use his legs more. And look, now that, the sting of trading DeAndre Hopkins is gone, you do have Brandon Cooks, Randall Cobb, and potentially a healthy Will Fuller, although I don't think you can count on his hamstrings at this point in any way. But that receiving group, it's not sexy, but it has some talent. There should be some value there. And another guy I'll throw out at you, since we're talking wide receivers and the depth he can get late, a guy there's 2. One is completely ignored at right now, is Josh Reynolds, who will likely be taking over that Brandon Cooks role with the Rams, probably undrafted at this point, as of the time that we're recording this today in average draft position. Nobody's going to be paying attention to him. He could be a flex for you. He really could. And then another guy that I think everybody's kind of more down on now than my personal stat projections and my feeling is based on Jay Gruden coming over in Jacksonville is DJ Chark, man. He and Gardner Minshew have downfield chemistry. It's not easy to find downfield chemistry. And DJ Chark asserted himself in his first basically healthy full season of duty last year. And his average draft position is pretty low for now. Now, that could change depending on when you're picking this episode or this draft value up. But you get him late, and I think he could be easily a wide receiver 2, maybe even a wide receiver 1 in this offense, this new offense, with the chemistry he has with an emerging quarterback, with a quarterback that's probably going to put up 4,000 yards because look what Gruden has done with Andy Dalton and Kirk Cousins in his stints at coaching. There is value there, to your point. There really is.
I think what concerns me about taking Thomas in the first round or even early second round is that we're just looking at last year and not really projecting the regression. Let's look at 2 of the historical seasons which compared to Michael Thomas's year. All right, you had Marvin Harrison, who had his career year 143 receptions, 1,722 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns. The next year, 94 receptions, 1,272 yards, 10 touchdowns. That's about 50 receptions less, 500 receiving yards less, and 1 less touchdown. He still had a great year. That was still a great year, but it's hard to expect that kind of extreme outlier production to continue at that level. Look at Antonio Brown, career year, 136 receptions, 1,834 yards, 10 touchdowns. That's very similar to Thomas's line from last year.
Mm-hmm.
The next year, 106 receptions, 1,284 yards, 12 touchdowns. Wasn't a bad year, but was it worth a high first-round pick or even mid-second? I'm not so sure about that. And then we talk about Emmanuel Sanders coming in. He's going to demand some sort of targets. You look at last year, the target distribution, the Saints, number 2 and number 3 wide receiver, Ted Ginn and Traquan Smith, combined for 48 receptions total.
I know.
I mean,
that's bad.
Emmanuel Sanders is probably going to soak up all of that and then some. Those targets are going to have to come from somewhere. Most likely outcome, a chunk of them are going to come out of Michael Thomas's role.
Yeah, and one thing to think about too, although Drew Brees and Drew, that connection is fantastic, but I think when Brees went out, and my concern, like I said before, was that Bridgewater wasn't going to involve, or maybe wouldn't even have the capability to involve Michael Thomas as much. I think he basically became kind of overly reliant on him, which helps Michael Thomas's numbers. I agree, man. I think Emmanuel Sanders, and by the way, as a team, I love the Saints this season. I think that they're right now the cream of the crop in the NFC if they can stay healthy, but they are aging a little bit, I recognize, and they have some kind of injury bugs going. But Emmanuel Sanders, that role on the other side of the field, maybe less targets, but I think that Michael Thomas could have more stuff over the top. It wouldn't shock me. Well, frankly, I think you should predict it because it's just basic. It's hard to reproduce. But I think he'll have less receptions, less yards. But I do think this is going to be the year that he actually ascends and gets these double-digit touchdowns. But I don't know that it's going to be enough to make up the volume he's going to lose in the receiving game. But I still think he's probably the number 1 overall receiver. It's just a matter – I don't even think we're arguing that. It's just like, when do you draft him? Would you – okay, let me ask you. I'll throw out a scenario. You're sitting at the 15 pick, all right? Number 15, you're on the clock. Michael Thomas is staring you right in the face. And Travis Kelce's staring you in the face. Are you really going to pass up Michael Thomas? Are you going to do it, number 15?
I think I would. I'm a tight end early truther,
Yeah.
You look at the numbers. There was I think 3 tight ends last year to clear 220 points. There was at least, I believe, 15 receivers to do that. So you're just looking at a way deeper market, even at the higher end of the production at wide receiver than you are at tight end.
Right.
I can't blame anyone for going Michael Thomas there. I really can't. But again, I think it's not exactly just a smash pick like a lot of people would like to believe.
One of the things I'm going to do, because as always, when I'm updating my book and updating the readers and all that, free updates, all that stuff, of course, I start really getting into fantasy football mock drafts. And I think you and I have talked about, like, we'll do a mock draft and we'll figure out if we're going to do a live, or like I'll share a screen and we'll just kind of comment. We can join the same mock draft and make a pick and say why we're picking and all that stuff. But one of the things I like to do is play with different scenarios. And like, let's say I give myself, like, I go to ESPN and I give myself in a 12-team league the number 8 pick. And I hope that Michael Thomas falls to me in that scenario. I take him at the 8, and then the flip around, maybe I take Kelce. And I'm doing this scenario just to see, okay, if I take the number 1 wide receiver and I take the number 1 tight ends in a PPR format, and then maybe in the 3rd round I draft Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes or something like that, right? And
running backs, huh?
No running back. I'm curious.
0 running backs.
Exactly.
Strategy.
And I'm not saying I endorse that for your fantasy football draft, but I want to see what happens if I'm in a PPR league. And I want to see what happens in rounds 4 through 7. Then I'm just like, okay, what platter of running backs can I find at this point that can get me some catches and make that up? So I dominate 3 positions in theory, right? You get the number 1 pick at all 3 positions, and then you're while all the other teams are then trying to capture those positions that they neglected because they went running back. What ends up happening psychologically in these drafts is, these teams go running back. Probably if you're in an 11 or a 12-team league, probably 10 of those teams are going to stray from running backs after they get their first 2 or 3 and start trying to find other pieces to round out their starters. I think that's the wrong thing to do, but that's what happens in drafts. So you end up finding more value, whether it's at receiver like we've been talking about, or whether it's at running back or so on. So I would bet you that some of these rookie running backs will be available in the 4th round. Like, could I get Cam Akers in the 4th round as of the time we're recording this today? Yes, I can. I don't think that'll be the case in August, if people are picking this up then. J.K. Dobbins, I do think he's going to be the starter in Baltimore at the end of the year. Can I get him in the 5th round? As of today, you can. Probably in August.
Mostert, another guy comes to mind. I
What's
love
that?
him. 5th
Mostert?
round.
Mostert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's going to be solid in the 5th round. Even 4th round, I'd be happy taking him.
So like if I'm looking at like a 6 or 7 round draft where I'm outlaying that scenario, and I think that's a realistic scenario again as of today. I pick Michael Thomas late in the first. In a swing, I get Kelsey. Maybe I get Patrick Mahomes to pair him with Kelsey for the stack in the 3rd round. Again, I think you can do that. Then I get Cam Akers in the 4th, Dobbins in the 5th, Mostert. I don't know if he'll be there, but another running back. Maybe Sony Michel or somebody like that. Stidham's taken over at quarterback in New England. Maybe Michel will get more run. You look at these guys, PPR league, maybe you're looking at James White, who's still going to be a focus in that offense, and Jared Stidham, I think, will dump down. You don't have the sexy running backs at the top, but you have some dominance in the other positions that can make up that competitive advantage. Again, I'm just talking about scenarios here. It'll be an interesting one. So maybe when we do some of these mock drafts, what I'd like to do, I don't see other people do that, but I'd like to give us some homework. Like maybe your job for that fantasy mock draft is, you try to dominate the running backs in the first 4 rounds. You just go nothing but running back. And then I'll just go no running backs for the first 3 rounds and see what we come up with, right? I think that'd be kind of fun in laying those scenarios out. And it's good for education, too, to kind of get a lay of the land. Another thing I like to do, by the way, David, with fantasy football mock drafts is if I like a guy, like, for instance, Edwards-Helaire, I'm big on the Kansas City Chiefs this year offense if you haven't picked up on that. I like him, but I want to know where he's going to go. So I just won't take him in any of my fantasy football mock drafts so I can plot out where he goes when other people take him. But anyway, I think I'm way off topic at this point. Do you have anything else on Michael Thomas since I veered so significantly?
Well, since we're talking about the strategies, let's just make this clear. I'm not endorsing a 0 running back strategy early.
Neither.
But the one selling point for that is the assets are a lot more stable at the top of your roster when you're going with that elite wideout Michael Thomas, maybe the quarterback round 2, I would say Lamar or Mahomes, and then hope to get maybe Kittle or even Mark Andrews, who I think is elite in round 3.
Yeah.
You're getting 3 positions that are not going to get hit as much. They have a lower injury rate. So you can kind of pencil those guys in as not really having much injury risk. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you take running back first 2 rounds, you could be in week 5 and have both of those guys be gone.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit more risk in the mid rounds. You got to hit on those running backs in the mid rounds. But if you're willing to, say go running back round 4, 5, 6, and maybe even if a guy with a pulse falls there in the 7th, and then get, say, your second wide receiver in the 8th round, there is some upside to the stability at the top of the roster. I will have to admit that.
Yep. And one other note, just since we're talking running backs, and maybe we can do another segment on this coming up, just to close out the show. If you're looking for running back late and you're in a PPR format, people are completely ignoring Chris Thompson and that signing in Jacksonville, which I called at the beginning of the offseason. Look at Jay Gruden's offensive play calling distribution, his history of play calling, his history of distribution. He had Gio Bernard for a little while in Cincinnati, Chris Thompson, of course, in Washington. Leonard Fournette, they are not going to bring him back next year. Gruden always goes with at least a 2/3 to 1/3 committee. He likes roles in the offense. And Chris Thompson is likely going to be that pass receiving running back. He's going to be healthy this year for the first time in a while. He's going to give you value. You can get him in the last round of your draft or pick him up off of waivers. If you're hurting at running back, so I'm looking at that from that point of view. If I'm in a PPR league, which I am in my typical redraft league, I know I could get James White late. And I do think, I know Tom Brady's gone, but I do think he's going to get receptions. I know I can get Chris Thompson literally the last round of my draft, and I don't think that's going to change by the end of the year. I know I can, by the way, get Jamison Crowder in like round 13 this year. I don't know why people are sleeping on him at this point. He's going to get a lot of receptions. So there is value out there. That's why I like to play around the mock drafts. And I know you're a big fantasy football mock draft guide, so I can't wait to kind of get in there and just dig into some of these scenarios. And I love the idea of just like, okay, here's your homework for the draft. And let's see where the chips fall. I think that'll be a fun exercise for viewers as well.
One more guy who comes to mind, too, if we're talking 0 running back late, you're talking those kind of receiving backs who are just getting completely ignored on draft day. Tariq Cohen. I mean, he's essentially a low-end RB2. Chicago didn't add any wide receivers. Taylor Gabriel's gone. He's going to have a receiving role. He's going to be that third down running back. Not sexy, but if you're going zero running back, you're probably not picking a lot of sexy options.
No.
So you're just kind of taking running backs who are going to touch the ball, one half of a committee, and just kind of hoping it works out. So one or two of them end up maybe seizing the whole gig due to an injury or something. Tariq Cohen, if David Montgomery goes down, I mean, he's got extreme upside with the receiving potential. Then if you throw in a little bit of carries per game, I mean, he's basically, you can get him 9th, 10th round in draft day.
Yeah, and I'm looking, I just pulled up his stats from my book here. So, like last year, people think of Tariq Cohen having a down year. And, of course, I'm not as high on David Montgomery. I like him more in standard leagues than I do in PPR leagues for reasons that I noted in my last book. But, okay, so Tariq Cohen, 2017, 71 targets, 53 receptions. He was kind of under the radar. His breakout year in 2018, 91 targets, 71 receptions, right? 725 yards, 5 touchdowns. Last year, in a quote-unquote down year, 104 targets, higher, 79 receptions, higher, but his yardage and his touchdowns were lower, probably because of the schemes, right, the opposing defensive schemes. But he was still involved in that offense. Nick Foles taking over at quarterback. They'll pass the ball a little bit more downhill or downfield, but they're still going to be using that rate. Like, Tariq Cohen's going to get some touches, and I think his yardage will increase, and I think his touchdowns will increase. And you're right, people are snoozing on this guy. Like, David Montgomery's getting on the hype, but Tariq Cohen's year after year, he's pretty consistently getting involved in that receiving game, and I don't see any threat to those receptions either or his role. So that's another guy. So it'll be interesting, man. I tell you what, I'm going to be doing another kind of like marketing push, but like in July. After July 4th, let's start fantasy football mock season, and I don't know, do live. I've never done a live. Maybe we can do a live or just record it and upload it wherever. I think that'll be fun. So cool, man.
I'm ready.
Hey, by the way, why don't you plug your website again, because I can never remember the exact URL, and your Twitter, and then we'll close out the show.
Yeah, if you want to check out the website, it's gurufantasyworld.blogspot.com. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's just at Guru Fantasy World, WRLD.
All right. Thanks a lot, David. We'll be back with new episodes coming up, fantasy focused. Everybody, thanks for listening to and watching the Get Paid show. Go out, make some bets and get paid.